Well, it's now episode 10 of Rockin' H Woodshop, and you know what that means. Yeah! Time for a good old country jig! Not that kind of jig. This kind of jig. Today, episode 10, it's all about the jigs. I'm going to go over with you one by one of the jigs that I've made over the years that I've actually kind of kept that are very versatile and useful in the shop. Show you how they're made and how they perform. So there's even a couple like this one right here, which is my finger joint jig. I've never tried to use it yet. I made it because I knew I wanted it, and I haven't even used it, so we'll see how it performs. I may have to make some changes, I don't know. But I even got some that are going to have to be redone because they don't work with my fence, such as this jointing jig here for the table saw, as well as my Sacrificial Fence, which is a friction fit over my last fence that I had. We're going to have to make another one. And then I have a picture frame spline cutting jig that I somehow must have gotten rid of because it also rode on the fence, and I guess because of the fact that I knew it wouldn't work on my new fence, I got rid of it. So if we have time, we'll make another one of those as well. So why don't we go ahead and get started. Alright, one of the jigs I'm going to start with happens right here at the bandsaw. It is a fence that I made because I acquired this bandsaw that did not have a fence when I got it. It did have a miter gauge, but that, as you know, doesn't cover everything. So what I did is I came up with this jig right here. And this is a fence that adjusts for the blade drift. And it runs right in the miter slot. If you look down here on the bottom, there is a runner right here that's made out of hardwood with a backstop that butts right up to the edge of the table whenever you scoot it in. And then I got a couple T-nuts that are epoxied in and hammered in place so they don't move. And what it does is it slides, like I said, right inside the miter slot. And it butts at that back runner, just kind of stops right there and holds it in place. And you just take a little wrench, loosen it up just a little bit, and once you've found the drift of the blade, and we're just going to pretend that we did, just take your bevel gauge that you use to set your angle, and you put it up right next to your fence, and then tighten it down. Then you have a fence that is adjusted for the blade drift. Now, one of the downsides about this that I didn't really count on is being able to slide it back and forth while the drift is still set. That's the only downside. I have to adjust the drift every time I need to adjust the width of my cut. So we'll probably come up with something like that later on and take care of that problem. Alright, now I figured I'd just start off with a little simple jig on the table saw. What this is just a Daito Jig. I've labeled it Daito Jig. All it is just a bunch of different dado sizes cut into just a scrap piece of, in this case, walnut that I had laying around. And if you have a piece of wood that you're trying to get a particular size dado for, it really helps to set up your dado blade a lot easier, because you can make marks inside each dado as to which blades and which shims made this particular slot. So let's just say this piece of plywood I'm trying to use for an actual dado in another piece of wood. Just take the plywood and run it through each one of your slots and find out which one's the better one. And in that case, that one right there is the better one. So I just look on my markings that I have, and it says that I have sides 3 1/8 inch and 1 3/32 blade, and there's no shim whatsoever, and it's the better fit for this piece of plywood. So I just take my dado set out, put those corresponding blades in, and make a test run and see if that particular wood fits, and generally it does. If it doesn't, it's just a matter of shimming every so little. So this is a very handy jig to have, and it will cover all the standard widths as well as plywood widths. All right, next is my miter jig. This is probably one of my favorite jigs, simply because it requires no fence and no adjustment of the blade except in height. You don't have to adjust for any angle. So if you're trying to make banding to go around, let's say this table saw extension wings that I have, and if you want to make a banding that has miter joints on the edges, or a countertop, then this is the jig for you. What it is a 45-degree angle cut. There's 2 of them, front and back. There's a piece of plywood on top, and then a piece of plywood on bottom. And also on bottom there is a hardwood, in this case walnut, runner that I have installed, and it's extra long. It extends past the width of the bottom board, just so I can have minimal racking in that miter slot. And it's just thin enough that it doesn't bind, and I've coated it with quite a bit of wax over the course of the year, so it's pretty seasoned, but you still need to coat it every once in a while. The way it works is you just insert the runner inside your miter slot, and then you push it up to your saw blade, adjust the height of your blade that's going to extend quite a bit higher. Then just go ahead and make your cut. Now my next jig is another one of my favorites, simply because it requires no fence and no adjustment of the blade except in height. This is my Stealth Fighter, and as you can plainly see, it does look like a Stealth Fighter. What this does is it cuts miters for picture frames. This one rides in 2 miter slots instead of 1, so it has no racking whatsoever, which is good, and it is a 0 clearance. Because it is just the exact width of the blade, because once you have it made, then you use the blade to cut up into your guard and you're ready to go. It's got a handle back here for easy pushing. It's just a dowel rod that passes all the way through the actual blade guard that attaches to 2 backer plates back here. So let's see how this works. Okay, now, I hope you don't judge me on this jig, because this is the first time that this is going to get tried out. What this is a finger box joint jig. And it is a base that has 2 plywood runners that are part of the sides, and has a backer fence that's screwed to the actual base itself, and then it has a little bitty stop here with an access hole for a screwdriver to make micro adjustments. This is one of the 5, I think. Yeah, one of the 5 different size finger joints that I have. It is a removable plate that actually has a little register right here for the finger that you just cut. You just move the board over and it slides over that little finger, and you just continue along. This little piece right here is a removable piece of hardwood that once it gets pretty chewed up, I can just remove it and then put a new one in. And then there is the little screw for micro adjustments that butts up to this little end cap that's on the base. Has two holes that are, they fall in line with the base itself. So once it's registered in the table saw, you just put the removable piece in like that, and then just stick your screws in. Okay, now next jig that isn't necessarily used for the table saw. Actually, there's no necessarily about it. It's not used for the table saw. This is my circular saw jig. Now you've seen me use this in prior episodes, and it is super simple to make. Just cut you a piece of plywood that's oversized, and then cut you another strip of wood that will be used as your guide rail fence. Be sure and leave yourself extra room on this side, because that's going to be your clamping space. So be sure and clamp this fence down, screw it in from underneath, or you can glue it, one or the other, and make sure that this section over here where your saw is going to ride is wider than the distance from the edge of your saw to your saw blade. And like I said, accommodate clamping room back here. Once that's set up, then just take your circular saw and run it down the length of this up against this guide rail fence, and then you would have a zero clearance guide rail fence for your circular saw. Very super simple to make. Alright, I'm going to go over this jig simply because for the people that don't necessarily have jointers in their shop, this would be a good alternative. It's actually using your table saw as a jointer. What this is, it actually rides on your fence, and if mine was the correct size it would work, but it slips over the actual fence itself and then butts up to this end cap down here up against your fence. Then you just take your saw blade, you move your fence over, and then raise your saw blade up into this to create this kind of alcove for your saw blade to ride in. Then, in order for a jointer to work, this half of the board has got to be thicker than this half, because as you run it across your saw blade, it's actually going to remove material. So what this is a piece of plastic liner that's very, very thin, but thin enough that I can use it as a spacer. And then I just glued it on that half. So whenever you butt your fence up to your saw blade, make sure that the edge of the saw blade in the front sticks out past a little bit, but is even with the back half, so you don't get any snipe. It's a very useful jig. Takes a little bit of time to make, but like I said, it is very useful if you don't have a jointer. Now, one of the jigs that I really liked using and really have to use when it comes to using my Daito set and my table saw is a Sacrificial Fence. Now, you can just take a simple piece of plywood and just clamp it to the actual fence. Personally, I don't like having to romp around the shop to go and get 2 or 3 clamps to be able to clamp this to a fence. So I'm going to go ahead and make one that's going to slip over the fence, kind of like the jointer fence did. The one I did before was kind of a friction fit. I didn't have a need for any kind of screw clamp whatsoever, so that's what we're going to do today. What I've got here is just a simple piece of plywood. This edge is going to be taller, so if I need to do any kind of clamping of feather boards to it, I can. And then we're going to have 2 more pieces that go off to the side and then down to the table on the other side of the fence. We're going to begin by just measuring the length of the fence and then cutting the board to length. Then put a piece of wood on top of your fence and measure that height, and then cut it to size. This will be the outside. Next, measure the width of the fence and then cut the top piece to the width. Then just make some test fits to see how everything fits together. If everything looks good, go ahead and scribe you a mark on the back side of your fence, and then mark with X's on which side of the line your screws need to be drilled. Then just clamp them together and screw them down pretty tight. Next, pre-drill the holes on the back side of your sacrificial fence and then screw them together. Now just raise your saw blade up into your sacrificial fence, and now you have your alcove. Well, there you have it, a nice, easy to make sacrificial fence. If you have any need to bury your blade up inside your fence, this is the best way to get it done. You can buy, if you are worried about the friction fit, which I have never had a problem with it, but if you don't trust it, you can buy some T-nuts to go on the back side of this part and screw you in some clamps that can go just right through this side, just little knurl knobs or just some big knobs that you can grab that can tighten up against the fence. You can also buy some pieces on Rockler that will attach to this section. You just drill a hole and then they clamp to the actual fence base itself. But I have used the friction fit fence for quite some time and I absolutely love it. It is the easiest jig that I have to put on my fence. It stays nice and square, it stays put, and I absolutely love it. So you saw how quick and easy it was to make this. Just make sure that your measurements are spot on so your friction fit is nice and snug. Now, one other jig that I wanted to make that's going to work on this new fence is my spline cutting jig that I use to help miter joints stay together. And it's going to be fairly same construction as my sacrificial fence that we just made, except it's not going to be a friction fit because it has to be able to slide back and forth on this fence, but also to the point where it can't rack this way. It's got to be nice and smooth gliding across the fence while simultaneously not being able to rack. So that's what we're going to make now, so let's go ahead and start that. First, we're going to begin by just measuring how tall we want the height of the jig. In my case, it was 16 inches. So just run it through, cutting it to height, and then readjust to 24 inches for the length. Be sure and save your scrap because you're going to need it later. Now measure the height for your side and cut it. Now measure the width of the fence, and this is very important. Be sure to accommodate an extra 32nd of an inch from the original dimension of your fence. Now, after a test fit and a test slide, go ahead and pre-drill your holes. Get it all clamped up and screw it together. Now take your side and scribe a mark just like the sacrificial fence, and then mark with X's where you need to drill your holes. Go ahead and pre-drill, re-clamp to your jig, and screw it down together. Alright, we're about halfway done. As you can see, this jig slides very nice on the fence. Just rub a little wax on the fence as well as on the inside of this jig, and it's going to be really smooth running. And you can see that it does not rack. So that is exactly what I wanted. The fence itself was 4 inches, and I cut this top section 4 1/32. So it's very, very minute, but just enough to get it to where it can move freely and not rack. So keep that in mind when you cut that top piece, because I had to do it twice. Now we're going to start making the cradle. We're going to use the scraps that we saved and then cut it immediately in half. Run both sides through to make sure they are the same size. Then take you a little speed square and run you a line down the 45-degree angle. Do this on both sides while leaving your space down at the bottom so it doesn't quite touch. Then just glue it up. Now, through the magic of TV, we're ready to unclamp. Go ahead and clean up your glue lines, and then cut it to length. Then go ahead and set your saw blade to 45 degrees and run it right up the line. Then just finish the cut on the bandsaw. Do a little bit of finish sanding to clean up all the bandsaw marks. Okay, now that we have the V-shape cut out and sanded down smooth to where it's nice and 45 degreed. That's a good word, wasn't it? 45 degreed. We're just going to take it and glue it up to the base so we can have a place to cradle our frame. And then once that is done, we'll be ready to make a test run. Now, this cannot be screwed simply because the blade is going to be running through this and you can't have any obstacles in its way. The only screws that you can put in are right here in the very top. The rest of this has got to be glue only. Now after applying glue, we're just going to set it in place, pre-drill and screw the top section, then clamp the bottom section. Alright, now time for the fun stuff. We've got the cradle already glued and screwed at the top but not at the bottom, just like I said. And what we need to do now is just cut a little mock-up miter joint for like a picture frame, set it in place, and then we'll make our kerf cut through. What I'll probably do is make 2 different height cuts, because if you have sometimes a thicker frame, it's always nice to have 2 splines. It's very decorative, one smaller than the other. So we'll make a kerf cut in the middle of this first piece of plywood, and then maybe a smaller cut in this second piece of plywood down a little bit lower. So let's go ahead and take care of that. Okay, with the mock-up frame inside the cradle, you can kind of get an idea of how this is going to work now. The jig is going to slide back and forth like this across the blade, and then the blade is going to make the spline from one side to the other. Now, when you put this in your cradle, you want to try and get the blade as far up as you can to make sure that you have enough glue surface of your spline to make a very strong joint. But if you can imagine this line representing the rabbet for your glass and picture and mat, you don't want your blade to exceed into that point. So you do want to lower your blade just below that mark. This will ensure that you won't encounter any problems when you go to put your glass and mat in, because your spline won't be impeding that area. So let's go ahead and make that cut. As you can see, spline running right down the middle of the frame. Now, one of the little tips on your jigs, including the Sacrificial Fence jig, when you find that location for that particular kerf, mark it on top of your jig so you always know where to set it. This one I set at 1 1/8 for my large one, and then my small one I haven't cut yet, but I have a spot ready to make the mark. So whenever I come back, all I got to do is find 1 1/8, lock it down, and run it through, and the kerf will be exactly where it's supposed to be. I hope you guys enjoyed this video and episode, and if you have any questions, feel free to email me. My email is rhwoodshop@gmail.com. I will be available to answer any questions that you might have. And if you have an idea for a project that you want me to try, send me an email and I'll get back with you, and you just might see that project on this show. So until next time, guys, be safe in your own shops and take care. Okay, one of the jigs I'm going to start with is, if you look, there is a miter found your angle, and we're just going to pretend that we did. Alright, another one of my favorite jigs that's going to be next is my Stealth Fighter. At least that's what some people call it. As you can tell, it does look like a jet fighter plane, but what it is also a miter jig that cuts widthwise miters for things like picture frames. So this is like a picture frame miter jig. Oh, that's a stupid thing. What the frick, man? Now, what the crap did I just measure?